The gasp that rippled through the ballroom lingered like a trembling cord held too long by an uncertain violinist. Though conversations had fractured into disjointed whispers, the world seemed to narrow itself around the Duke of Harland, who remained before Eleanor with a posture carved from resolve. His hand still held hers, steady and warm, as though he intended to shield her from the torrent of gazes pressing in on every side. The brilliance of the chandeliers, the glitter of silk gowns, and the gilded symmetry of the room seemed muted next to the singular force of his devotion. For a moment Eleanor forgot the crowd entirely, seeing only the man who had overturned the rhythm of her life with a gesture no one could ever rewrite. His dark eyes held none of the arrogance people claimed he possessed. Instead, they brimmed with an earnestness that made her pulse stumble in confusion. She had spent years believing her fate had already been carved, an inevitable march toward a marriage arranged for convenience, not affection. Yet here he was, a man forged by battle and tempered by restraint, making a declaration before England's finest as if her answer determined the trajectory of his existence. The surreal quiet stretched until Eleanor feared she might faint from the pressure of it. "Why here?" she whispered, the words trembling despite her effort to steady them. She had intended strength but could summon only naked bewilderment. He rose with measured grace, taking her upward with him as if anchoring her to her own footing. "Because hiding has brought you nothing but sorrow," he murmured. "You deserve a beginning that is seen, remembered, and respected." Her chest tightened at the gentleness in his tone. No one, certainly no suitor, had ever considered her deserving of anything more than duty. Even her sisters, radiant with youthful beauty and social triumphs, had drawn admiration that left her overshadowed by comparison. Lady Marianne and Lady Clara had always been the jewels of the Ashcombe family, while Eleanor had been cast as the dull stone set behind them, necessary to the arrangement but never worthy of its attention. Yet now she stood in the center of the grand ballroom, the focus of every astonished eye, while her sister's forced composure cracked like brittle glass. Marianne's smile faltered at the edges. Clara's fan snapped shut with a sound sharp enough to slice through the murmurs. Their expressions betrayed not only shock but something more piercing, envy sharpened by disbelief. The eldest spinster, the one whose prospects had once seemed so unremarkable, had captured the loyalty of the most powerful duke in England. The social order they had trusted now trembled under this unexpected reversal. But Eleanor barely registered their reactions. Her heartbeat drowned out everything else. "I do not understand," she said softly. "You have no obligation to involve yourself this boldly." He leaned closer, just enough that his words brushed her ear with intimate warmth. "I know your betrothal was forced upon you. I know you feared losing yourself beneath duty." His voice lowered further, colored with emotion he rarely revealed. "And I know what it is to return from war and find the world colder than the battlefield. But you remind me there is still something gentle left to fight for." Her breath caught. She had not anticipated the raw sincerity in his confession. His reputation was one of precision, discipline, and emotional distance. Yet now he stood exposed, offering her a truth that left her reeling. Before she could gather herself enough to respond, a shift stirred at the far end of the ballroom. The ornate doors swung open with a jarring force, and Lord Ashcombe burst inside, his coat rumpled and breath uneven. Eleanor's stomach tightened. Her father's expression was thunderous, an eruption long feared and now unavoidable. "Eleanor," he boomed, storming through the startled cluster of guests. "What nonsense is this? You will not accept this man's offer without my consent." The murmurs surged like a fresh wave. Eleanor flinched out of instinct. The years of discipline, command, and silencing had conditioned her to shrink before him. Her father had always spoken as though his authority were law, unchallenged, immovable, absolute. The old fear crashed over her with familiar ferocity, cold and suffocating. But before the remnants of that fear could pull her backward, the Duke stepped forward. His posture shifted, subtle but unmistakable, protective, resolute, unyielding. "Sir," he said, voice poised and clear, "your daughter has acted with grace. There is no fault in her conduct tonight." Her father glared, his fury barely contained. "She is my responsibility. My authority remains unchallenged, Your Grace. The Duke did not bow or retreat. His words sharpened into steel. Authority is not licensed to silence her. She deserves the freedom to choose, and I will not stand idle while she is denied it. A collective inhale shuddered through the crowd. It was unprecedented. A duke confronting a father publicly, refusing to yield even an inch. Eleanor's world tilted again. Two powerful forces stood locked in opposition, yet neither asked what she wanted. They spoke as though she were an object battled over, a prize to be claimed, rather than a woman capable of choosing her own destiny. A sudden clarity flickered within her, faint at first but growing brighter. She stepped forward, her voice surprisingly steady. "Father." He froze, astonished that she dared interrupt. Eleanor swallowed, her heart thrumming so loudly she feared it echoed across the marble floor. I will not be spoken for." The room felt quiet enough to hear the flicker of candles. Her father's brows knitted in disbelief. The Duke's expression softened, pride glimmering beneath his composure. The crowd leaned in, sensing history in the making. Eleanor drew a breath, gathering every fragmented piece of strength she had long buried. "Not tonight. Not ever again." Her words did not tremble. They did not retreat. And for the first time in her life she felt the ground beneath her feet truly belonged to her. The Duke watched her with unwavering admiration. Her father stared as though he no longer recognized the daughter before him. And Eleanor, standing between two futures, felt something she had never felt before. A fragile, exhilarating taste of freedom that promised more if she dared reach for it. Edward remained motionless long after the door closed behind Eleanor, as if the silence itself demanded an answer he could not yet form. The memory of her trembling voice lingered, awakening an unfamiliar ache he had long believed himself incapable of feeling. He paced toward the hearth, struggling to understand why her quiet dignity unsettled him more than any court challenge. Eleanor's confession had not merely stirred sympathy but ignited something far deeper, something he feared naming too soon. He sensed she carried wounds she refused to reveal. That truth tightened its grip on him, compelling him toward a decision. Across the mansion, Eleanor stood before her small dressing mirror, her fingers tracing the ribbon at her neckline with restless uncertainty. Edward's expression earlier had unsettled her more deeply than she wished to admit, for she could no longer dismiss his sincerity as mere courtesy. The Duke's concern felt piercing, almost intimate, as though he saw through the careful composure she had spent years constructing. She feared what he might uncover if he ventured further. Yet part of her longed for someone to try. That quiet yearning frightened her more than the world that had always dismissed her. Later that afternoon, as rain drifted softly across the estate grounds, Eleanor wandered into the library seeking refuge among familiar shelves. She found comfort in the muted scent of parchment and dust, a world where expectations did not chase her. Yet even here her thoughts returned to Edward's conflicted stare, a look filled with questions she was unprepared to answer. She knew he sought truth, not compliance, and that made him dangerous in unexpected ways. When the door creaked open behind her, she stiffened instinctively, already knowing who had followed her into the sanctuary. Edward paused at the threshold, momentarily uncertain whether he was intruding upon a private moment. The soft glow of the library lamps painted Eleanor in warm hues, illuminating a fragility he had not noticed before. He stepped closer, quietly closing the door behind him, allowing the hush of the room to settle around them. Eleanor turned reluctantly, her guarded eyes searching his face for intent. He offered no rehearsed charm, only the sincerity that pressed relentlessly upon him since their last conversation. He asked if she wished him to leave, though the faint tremor in his voice betrayed his hope she would say no. Eleanor lowered her gaze, unwilling to reveal how his presence unsettled the carefully ordered stillness she relied on. She replied that he might stay if he wished, though her voice carried the hesitant cadence of someone unsure of the cost. Edward approached slowly, giving her space even as the distance between them seemed charged with unspoken truths. He asked gently why she hid her pain from him, and she deflected, insisting it was insignificant compared to his burdens. Yet he sensed her retreat was a shield, not indifference. When she turned away, he followed only with words, not steps. He said he wished to understand her, not to pry but to stand beside her in whatever shadow she fought alone. His honesty unsettled her composure, for no one had ever offered partnership rather than expectation. She confessed in halting phrases that years of being overlooked had taught her to silence her needs before anyone could dismiss them. Edward listened without interruption, absorbing each fragile word with a reverence that made her chest tighten. He told her she was not invisible to him. The earnestness in his declaration left her breathless, unsure whether to trust or flee. Silence settled between them, not heavy but delicate, as though both feared shattering its fragile honesty. Eleanor steadied herself by gripping the edge of a nearby table, feeling the polish would ground her wavering thoughts. Edward stepped closer, though still keeping a respectful distance, and told her he believed she had endured far more than she allowed others to see. His insight pierced her defenses. She admitted that the world had always measured her worth by comparison to her sisters, leaving her to navigate loneliness disguised as acceptance. Edward's jaw tightened, not at her confession but at the injustice she endured. Eleanor's breath wavered as she realized how fully he grasped the weight she carried, and for the first time she allowed a sliver of vulnerability to surface. Edward moved to stand beside her, not touching, simply offering quiet solidarity. He spoke of the expectations placed upon him, the relentless scrutiny, and the loneliness that clung even to power. His admission surprised her, revealing a man far less invincible than society pretended. Their shared understanding softened the tension between them. As the rain thickened outside, the room seemed to shrink around their confessions, binding them in an unexpected intimacy neither had sought. When the fire crackled softly, Eleanor finally met his gaze without flinching, letting him see the vulnerability she usually kept hidden. Edward felt the shift between them and instinctively reached out, stopping himself just before his hand brushed hers. She noticed the hesitation and, instead of retreating, offered the smallest nod of permission. Their fingers touched lightly, a fleeting contact yet powerful enough to anchor them both. Eleanor felt a strange steadiness settle within her, as though her fears no longer owned every corner of her thoughts. Edward sensed the change and spoke her name with quiet reverence. He told her he wished to protect her not out of duty, but out of a deepening affection he could no longer ignore. The confession stole the breath from her lungs, for she had never imagined the most powerful man in England would speak to her with such unguarded tenderness. She whispered that she feared believing him, not because she doubted his sincerity but because hope had always been a dangerous companion. Edward promised he would not rush her, only ask for a chance to prove himself worthy of her trust. Her heart trembled, yet she felt herself leaning gently toward possibility. Outside, the rain softened at last. Eleanor awoke the next morning with a curious stillness resting over her thoughts, as though the night had carefully rearranged her fears into something gentler, something she could finally examine without trembling. The memory of Edward's earnest confession remained vivid, warming her even as uncertainty lingered like a cautious shadow. She had spent years burying the hope that anyone might see her as more than a forgotten eldest sister, yet now the most powerful duke in the realm had offered his heart with a sincerity she could no longer dismiss as kindness. Still, she feared trusting a future that seemed far brighter than any she had allowed herself to imagine. She feared that the world would twist his intentions, belittle his choice, or worse, humiliate them both. Those worries pressed upon her even as she fastened her gown, preparing for a day that promised confrontation she could no longer avoid. Edward, meanwhile, stood before the tall windows of his study, watching sunlight chase away the last remnants of rain from the gardens below. He felt clearer than he had in years, as though admitting his feelings to Eleanor had unlocked something long dormant within him. Yet determination did not erase the obstacles awaiting them. He knew the tongue would hiss at the idea of a duke choosing a woman who did not fit their narrow expectations. Some would whisper that Eleanor lacked beauty, others that she lacked charm, and still more that she lacked the youth they prized so carelessly. But Edward had already steeled himself against their judgment. He had faced political insults, military threats, and social sabotage throughout his life, none compared to the thought of allowing Eleanor to slip away simply to please a world that had never earned the right to dictate whom he loved. His mind settled, unshakably firm, on the decision he would make before the day ended. When Eleanor entered the grand hall later that morning, she found the air thick with the hushed tension of her visiting family. Her sisters, adorned in silk and excitement, had clearly heard whispers from the household staff, for they eyed her with a mixture of astonishment and envy that made her stomach twist. Their curiosity was sharp enough to wound. She held her composure despite the familiar sensation of being measured against them. For once, however, the comparison stung less. She walked past them with a quiet strength she had not known she possessed until now, intending to reach the garden where she assumed Edward had gone. But before she could escape, her youngest sister intercepted her with a teasing remark about dukes and spinsters and miracles. Eleanor paused only long enough to respond with an unexpectedly calm certainty that left her sisters blinking in confusion. Then she slipped outside, refusing to let their voices shape her destiny any longer. She found Edward by the old stone fountain, its waters sparkling beneath the mid-morning sun. He turned the moment he sensed her, the tension in his features easing as though her presence had been the answer to a question he had carried since dawn. She approached slowly, uncertain how to bridge the fragile space between them. Edward stepped forward before hesitation could take root, telling her that he wished to speak openly, without the caution that had defined both of their lives for far too long. Eleanor listened, her hands clasped tightly before her, as he explained that he would not allow society to dictate his choices. He said he admired her strength, her integrity, and the quiet resilience she had carried alone for so many years. He told her she had awakened a feeling he thought himself incapable of experiencing, one that grew stronger every moment he spent in her company. Eleanor's throat tightened as she absorbed the gravity of his words. She felt the world narrowing to just the two of them, as though fate had constructed this moment with deliberate care. When Edward finally asked if she could believe in what he offered, even if believing required courage she had not been allowed to practice, Eleanor felt the walls she had built crumble not with fear but with relief. She admitted she was frightened, but she also confessed that he had shown her more respect, tenderness, and understanding in a few weeks than society had shown her in a lifetime. She told him she wanted to trust him not because he was a duke, but because he was Edward, the man who listened when others dismissed, who saw her when others turned away, and who valued her voice even when she whispered it. Her honesty struck him with unexpected force, and he reached for her hands with a steadiness that erased the last fragments of her doubt. Yet neither of them knew that the Dowager Duchess had been observing from the terrace steps, her presence silent but far from idle. She had feared this moment for reasons she had not shared with her son, reasons rooted not in social expectations but in the fear of seeing him repeat the loneliness she had endured in her own marriage. When she stepped forward, Eleanor stiffened, expecting rejection sharp enough to bruise. Instead, the dowager addressed her with a measured softness that surprised them both. She acknowledged that Eleanor was unlike the women the world expected Edward to choose, but she said this difference was precisely what had drawn her attention. She had watched Eleanor navigate the household with humility, kindness, and quiet intelligence, and she had seen how Edward changed in her presence, how he softened without weakening, how he listened rather than commanded, how he finally seemed content. The dowager admitted she wanted her son to marry someone who would challenge him gently, who would steady him with patience, and who would love him without ambition. She said Eleanor had shown every sign of being that person. Eleanor felt her chest warm with a blend of shock and gratitude, for she had never imagined gaining the blessing of someone who held so much influence over Edward's life. Edward, moved by his mother's unexpected support, clasped Eleanor's hands more firmly and asked, with a voice steady and sure, if she would allow him to build a life with her, not out of obligation, not out of expectation, but out of love. Tears blurred Eleanor's vision as she whispered yes, the word trembling with both vulnerability and astonishing certainty. Edward smiled with a joy she had never seen on his face before. As he drew her gently into his embrace, Eleanor felt the weight of her years of invisibility lift at last, replaced by a future woven not from fear, but from the quiet, enduring strength of two hearts choosing each other despite the world.